Otherwise, if you look at a map and it's flat, it looks crazy. But if you are out here and following the lay of the land, you see
Right.
they're following the high ground. They also dig their line at night, which doesn't help to see what they're constructing. But. All right, so just a couple observations first as we come up. For those of you who were walking along, if you saw the last sign that we passed back in the woods, that actually would have been the line for the historic tree line. So from that point on, which is actually very close to the modern tree line, we'd have been in open ground. Now, again, considering how well orchestrated this attack is, from the low ground, you probably had no idea that right here is the Confederate line. Because we actually had a pretty decent amount of cover. And from here, if you turn around and look back, how well would you have been able to fire at the soldiers coming up from the low ground? Not at all.
Very well.
And from up here, you can see that we do have artillery off to the side here. But in that low ground, you never saw the artillery, and they would not have been able to fire at you either. This is a really excellent position that the 6th Corps officers have chosen to attack this point on the salient. So, with that, let's get into the directions given to each of these lines to see how successful this is. Keep in mind, again, this is a brilliantly orchestrated attack. The first line, some of Upton's units, himself, the 121st New York, the 96th Pennsylvania, and the 5th Maine, come forward. Horatio Wright, the very Corps commander himself, walks up to Colonel Clark Edwards of the 5th Maine and says, "Colonel, I give you the place of honor in this charge." Who wants the place of honor? Nobody wants the place of honor, but he accepts it, of course. And the mission of the first line is that as soon as they break through, 2 of the units are to turn to the right and charge the battery down here. The 5th Maine, in the place of honor, is to wheel to the left and fire. So we break through the lines and then we spread out in either direction to exploit the breach. The second line, the 49th Pennsylvania, the 6th Maine, and the 5th Wisconsin, as they come forward, their job is to hold the breach in the works. So as the first line exploits and moves around, the second line is supposed to come up and hold that opening. Why? It's gonna cover your flank. Also, how do you expect to get back across the field if things go poorly? You better have your opening secured, right? The third line, the 43rd New York, the 77th New York, and the 119th Pennsylvania, their job is to take a position behind the second line and wait for orders. So they're going to be standing, essentially piling right into this opening and hold on as long as they can. The fourth line, the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Vermont, those units that have been chewed up at the wilderness, their job is to stand at the tree line and hold as needed in reserve, that they'll push on forward as they're called upon. You see, again, the extreme organization of this attack, how each officer needs to know exactly what he's responsible for and how to execute it. As they do so, they come charging up from the bottoms where we just came from into the open field. They catch the Confederates largely by surprise. There's about 5,000 men in this attack, and when they break through the lines, they do exactly as they're ordered. They wheel out in each direction. That battery is captured pretty darn quickly, and the line is breached and the men spread out. As the second and third lines come up, they are called to move into the action, and the breach expands to about a mile. They're able to cover all, even beyond that battery that you see in place, and they're able to stretch about halfway between us and that fence line in a very successful attack. They scoop up about 1,000 prisoners initially, so for 5,000 men, not a bad deal, right? But what dooms a lot of attacks in the Civil War?
Follow through.
Follow through, right? So you've been successful enough to break through the lines, but now what are you going to do about it? For Emory Upton, this attack was one of 3 attacks that were supposed to go forward on the 10th. We mentioned back at Laurel Hill that there was another attack planned that day on that end of the line, and there's actually a third attack that's planned to go off simultaneously against the tip of the salient off in this direction. Through miscommunication, these attacks do not go off simultaneously. Gouverneur K. Warren asks to attack early because he wasn't successful 2 days ago and he wants to prove himself. And so then they decide to delay the attack until later. Our friends back at the tip of the salient don't get the memo, and so these attacks actually go off at different times. In Upton's understanding, these fellows attacking the tip of the salient are supposed to support him. They're supposed to fill in immediately behind his attack. But that's not what their orders say, and they aren't successful. Which means that Upton expects support that's never going to come. His men hold on as long as they can, but as soon as this section of the line is breached, what are the Confederates going to do? Counterattack and start to fill it in. So what we can see from here, if you look to where you can see kind of a roof in the distance and a couple barns right before the far tree line, that's essentially the center of the salient. That's the McCool house. We'll be there a little bit later. Once there's a break in the lines here, Dick Ewell, who's commanding the entire Confederate 2nd Corps, which is what fills this salient, rides over and tells his men to hold on because he'll have enough men in 5 minutes to eat up every damn one of them. He rides to the other side of the salient. One of the good things about having interior lines in a bulge like this is that if there's an attack only going on this side, he can go over to his troops on the other side, tell them to about face, and cover that distance to fill in. And so a Confederate counterattack is launched, and these men are driven out of their position. They're able to hold on for a short while, have an extreme amount of success thinking about 1,000 prisoners in one quick go, a breach in the lines. But without support, it isn't really enough to change the game here. But it is enough to give us all a bit of an idea, right? How can you attack earthworks successfully? What happens when you think outside the box? So there is some real success that takes place here, and there's some long-lasting repercussions. This is one of the main highlights of the entire Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, because we see people thinking differently, we see them being creative, and we see what this leads to. There is a quote often attributed to Ulysses S. Grant that says, well, 5,000 today, we'll try a corps tomorrow. Can't actually find much of a source for that, but I think the thinking holds. You see what 5,000 men concentrated on one point can achieve. What happens if you use 20,000 men against a different point? And that feeds into the thinking of what will take place on May 12th, what we're about to talk about next. But I also want to talk about Upton for a little bit. I don't want to leave him behind. Because you see that he's just led this great successful attack. He was told to turn a live brigadier general or a dead colonel. And he returns, and he doesn't feel he's overly successful. But he is put in for a promotion on May 12th to brigadier general, and even though it takes a while to go through the paperwork in D.C., he does finally get his promotion. So good news for Upton, because he is an extremely competent officer. He's a brigadier general at age 24, which is more than a lot of us can say, I think. He's a brevet major general by its close, having commanded in all 3 branches of the Army. This is a real rising star. In 1867, the United States Army adopts his tactics. He writes a book called A New System of Infantry Tactics, and they adopt it. He's a commandant of cadets at West Point by 1870. Pretty impressive career. And so a lot of times I think we end up reading this attack backwards. Because Upton has such a bright career, we often think that this is actually Upton's idea, whereas he's just carrying it through and part of the conversation. But then things start to turn a little bit tragic for Upton, and we see a little more of his personal life. His wife dies very early. They get married in 1868, and she dies in June of 1870. It's a massive, crushing blow to Upton. They were a couple very much in love. And what's more is, as the years pass, he becomes plagued by these brutal, constant headaches. And he sees a lot of doctors, but none of them can tell him what's wrong, let alone fix anything. And he becomes more and more despondent by his condition. And what's more... You should reach your destination by 11:45 a.m. If only, right? I'm afraid we've got a little longer than that. But I understand the wishful thinking. What's more is he's come up with all of these tactics, and I mentioned earlier that when we talk about changing warfare and new tactics, a lot of these officers' goal is to save the lives of their men, right? They want to kill more of the enemy and to save more of themselves. For Upton, his goal was actually to reduce warfare to a kind of science or a math, to where you didn't even need to fight it anymore, because you could tell who would win just by looking at the numbers and looking at the tactics you could employ. He wants to eliminate warfare, ideally. But he's afraid that his tactics might actually do more harm than good. He's actually equipping people to kill people better. And I'm not sure that's exactly what he wanted. He's afraid also that his condition, his constant headaches, are going to render him absolutely useless. That he'll have to resign from the life that he's devoted his entire career to. And then what? And then his friends began to suggest that his thinking his condition was impacting his thinking in the last few days of his life, because Upton actually committed suicide because as a result of his condition. So despite his meteoric career, he ends up dying pretty tragically because he simply can't find a cure. He's probably depressed due to his condition and the loss of his wife. And you see also that the environment in which Upton thrived is gone. The place where he was always successful here on the battlefield, he's no longer there. And then for his men here, in the aftermath, you see also a different sort of character. You have one man from Vermont. In the direct aftermath of the attack, you see their response. They're very frustrated. One man said this, that being ordered to fall back after this attack is no longer successful, I assure you, was galling to the pride of brave men. When I got by myself where I would not be ashamed of it, I cried like a whipped spaniel. I saw many soldiers cry like girls, and many who took things less to heart gave vent to their mortification at having lost all they had gained so nobly by the fault of others, by letting of unnumbered salvos of profanity. So if you're a man and a soldier, you usually don't cry. These men have seen a lot of hard service. This is a Vermont man. This same brigade took incredible casualties during the fighting at the Battle of the Wilderness just days before. And so maybe it's a level of combined suffering. Maybe it is that what they saw here, that their gains being lost, was too much for them to handle. But in any case, you see the men responding to it in different ways. Grant may see an opportunity, but to these men they see an opportunity lost, squandered, that their comrades had died for, that was not going to be taken advantage of. And Upton isn't the only one who has long-lasting consequences here. For the Confederates, one Georgia soldier wrote, N. Ewing Scott, brother of Lieutenant Goodwin Scott, was shot through the head and killed about nightfall near the works. First Sergeant R.H. Jenkins, with the writer and 2 others, were detailed to bury him. We carried him on his blanket, one of us at each corner, about 200 yards to the rear, and buried him in a fence corner near the McCool house. The McCool house stood right in the center here. We had nothing to dig a grave with but bayonets and tin plates. We wrapped Ewing in his blanket and deposited his body in a shallow grave. The best we could do. One of the party picked up a board, cut the initials NESG, 12 Georgia, and placed it at the head. His brother wrote, Deeply am I grieved at his death, one so young and full of promise. I have felt sad ever since his death. I have not shed a tear. I cannot cry. I wish I could. It would to some extent relieve my feelings. It seems that all the finer sensibilities of my nature are gone. So you see, we've talked a lot about men who changed war, and then you see the opposite, men being changed by war itself. As somebody who says that all the finer sensibilities of his nature are gone. We see some men who can't do anything but cry, and then we have some who wish they could cry. It's the result of a different kind of warfare. And so for a lot of these men, the road ended right here. They have makeshift graves, and they're pretty lucky to have even those. They're very lucky if they're known and end up in marked graves. And for those who remain, they have to struggle with the loss and struggle with how war changed them. I think perhaps even more to the point, to realize that this is the middle of May of 1864. The war is a different war than they've seen the past several years, and it's only going to get worse from here. We're about to head up to the Bloody Angle area, and if you know anything about the Battle of Spotsylvania, this is the most famous section of the battlefield. And we'll make one more stop before we get there, but I think it's worth thinking about these accounts, and then think about how war progresses and how it changes, and how much more effective these folks are going to be as the campaign continues, as hardship mounts as we go along. So on that positive note, we'll head on up.